Hey, I'm Dr. Bob Cargill.
I'm Jordan Jones.
And this is Bible and Archaeology Frequently Asked Questions. Jordan, I hear we have a question from one of our viewers. What are they asking?
Yeah, we have a question here from a reader asking about the ending of the Gospel of Mark.
Oh, yeah.
They say they were reading Mark 16 and noticed several notes at the bottom of the page discussing what may or may not have been original and are looking for some clarification. So, Bob, what exactly is going on with the ending of Mark?
Yeah, this one I remember learning about when I was in divinity school, learning about it for the first time, saying, wait a minute, time out. You're telling me that the text that I'm reading in the Bible maybe might have been added to, tampered with, maybe wasn't all a complete work of one hand. And when I first heard that from a devout person of faith, right, teaching me, I was like, yeah, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. But the more the evidence was presented to me, the actual physical evidence, I was convinced. And here's what most scholars think is happening. The oldest manuscripts that we have, including the oldest complete copies of the Bible, this is from the 300s, the 4th century. This is Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus. On Mark chapter 16, they only have the first 8 verses of Mark 16. And then that's the end of the chapter. And if you recall, it's got the women showing up at the tomb, and it basically ends with, and they were afraid. And so this is actually very consistent with the rest of the Gospel of Mark. It just kind of leaves you hanging. They don't know what to do. Think about how the Gospel of Mark starts, right? It doesn't start like Matthew and Luke do with a genealogy or the story about the birth of Jesus and his childhood. It just jumps right into his ministry. And during his ministry, there are a lot of doubters. A lot of people don't know what to make of this guy. And there are a lot of people who aren't sure whether or not to believe. And throughout the whole thing, there are a lot of people who are afraid. They don't know whether to follow this guy. And that's basically how the Gospel of Mark ends. I think it's brilliant literature. I think it's written in that way. These women show up at the tomb. They're going to check on him to see what's going on. They see that the stone's already rolled away, and they're afraid. And then the curtain comes down. That's the end of the story. And now the responsibility is on the reader. The decision is on the reader. What am I going to do? Right? It thrusts the reader or the hearer, if it was being read aloud to people in antiquity, it thrusts the hearer of the gospel to make a decision. Am I going to believe? Am I afraid? Because the people who were thinking about, being Christians, or maybe people who were Christians, were probably afraid. Hey, I'm afraid too. What decision am I going to make? And so this was very compelling literature to the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark originally ended with, they were afraid and they didn't know what to do. Curtain comes down. If you think about it, it's like the ending of the movie Inception, right? The top spinning and you don't know what to do, and then end of movie. And you're like, oh, well, what do I do now? What was the ending? Or the ending of The Sopranos, right? Don't stop believing. And you hear the jingle in the background and they're sitting there and it cuts to black. And you're like, oh, I wonder what happens. What would I do? What would I do in that situation? And you're talking about it, and you go to your friends and you're talking about it. That's good literature. That's why those were great, a great television show and a great movie. And that's the original ending of Mark. And if you look down in the footnotes, like the person who asked the question did, you'll see all of the earliest manuscripts don't have verses 9 through 20.
So then the question has to be asked, if we have this compelling ending in verse 8, fade to black, why add anything on?
Yeah, what happened was the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Remember, Mark's written first, and it's just a speed gospel, right? It's just go, 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 go. People believe, people don't. And that it ends, and you have to make a decision. And then Matthew and Luke write their Gospels with a copy of the Gospel of Mark in front of them, and they're using the Gospel of Mark to add and to tell more stories with other sources. And as they tell this story, then when people now are looking at the Gospel of Mark, they are saying, well, Mark looks kind of truncated, right? Luke has this great ending and Matthew has this, this great commission. And now Mark looks like, maybe somebody chopped off the original ending. Maybe what is this movie, right? If these are the people who look at the end of Inception and look at the end of The Sopranos and are like, hey, we got cheated here. We got ripped off. What tell us what to do, right? And this is also now going into the 5th century when people are like, okay, we need to know what the church believes. What should we be doing? And so people wanted to see harmony. They wanted to see consistency. And so what most scholars believe happened was somebody came along and took verses from these other Gospels, maybe Matthew, and basically started writing, creating, crafting another ending, a longer ending for the Gospel of Mark. So verses 9 through 20 have these things in it, this vocabulary, these themes that aren't really consistent with the rest of Mark. It's got a Great Commission in it that looks a little bit like the Great Commission in Matthew. All of a sudden, you've got this reference to, and you will drink poison and you will handle snakes. That's where this snake handling verse comes from at the end of Mark there. You've got these other things that basically sum up, like Luke and Matthew do, in a way that wasn't consistent with Mark. But it made Mark look more like Luke and Matthew. And so those verses get tacked on, but we don't see those verses until manuscripts that are much later. Codex Alexandrinus has this longer version of the ending of Mark, but not until the 400s, not until the 5th century. And so Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which are earlier, don't have this ending, but we see this ending start to appear in the 5th century. And so scholars think that maybe in the 2nd century, so if Mark's written, let's say around 70 CE, in the late part of the 1st century, the 2nd century, somebody comes along and crafts this later ending of Mark, and yet the tradition still has the original, first 8 verses of Mark showing up in the earliest copies, the earliest manuscripts of Mark. But then that longer ending of Mark starts showing up in let's say the 5th century.
So what are we supposed to do as modern readers? We come to the end of Mark. We got the short ending in verse 8. We got these longer endings. What's your opinion? Read it all? Read it all with a grain of salt?
We need to remember that the Gospels are written by many hands. Now, I'm not just talking about Matthew. There's a gospel attributed to Matthew. There's a gospel attributed to Mark, Luke, John, and, the Apostle Paul wrote a bunch of letters. Other people wrote things. But these works were also edited. And they were changed, right? We have a very famous story of the woman caught in the act of adultery that doesn't show up in any of these early manuscripts, but it's such a good story that somebody decided to tuck it in right there into the Gospel of John. It's a very profound story. It's something that it's consistent with the teachings of Jesus, but it's not in any of the earliest manuscripts. Somebody added that story to the Gospel of John. And somebody added this ending to the Gospel of Mark. Now, does that mean that it's not inspired because it wasn't original? If we play that game, then how do we know what was added and what wasn't added? All we know is what we have by the time that these groups got together, these councils, and they started voting and writing letters and deciding. And if you read the end of my book, The Cities That Built the Bible, you'll see that there's group after group and decision after decision that are debating, that are arguing which books should be in and which books should be out. And they're arguing based on who they believe wrote these books and which ones they believe to be authentic. And there's lots of different reasons for why they believe these books should be included in the canon and which ones shouldn't be in the canon. What I'm saying is, as a person who studies these documents, I can only tell you when the verses were added. Whether or not you believe in them, whether or not you want to see them as authentic, whether or not you want to see them as inspired, which is a whole other idea, that's up to the reader. That's up to the individual. All we know is those verses 9 through 20 were added at a later date.
So let's take it back to the reader's question just to wrap things up. What's going on at the end of Mark? Church history? Is that a fair answer?
I think that at the end of Mark, what you've got is an attempt to harmonize a gospel that was the original gospel, right? It's the OG, it's the original gospel. And it ended in a way that was consistent with the writing of the Gospel of Mark. But once Matthew and Luke come along, it looked odd. And so somebody came along, maybe multiple people came along and added these verses so that the ending of Mark wasn't as abrupt. And again, I think that abrupt ending is consistent with the way Mark wrote. Mark was a quick gospel. It just picked up when Jesus started his ministry and it ended, and it just sucks the reader into the gospel and makes the reader part of it. It makes the reader have to make decisions. But once Matthew and Luke exist, it needs to look more like those gospels. And so somebody took bits and pieces from Luke and Matthew and Franken-edited this longer ending and tacked it onto the Gospel of Mark.
So it's all about harmonization.
Yeah.
Interesting. Remember, if you have questions, you can submit them at the Bible and Archaeology website or just leave them in the comments down below.
That's right. And for Jordan Jones, I'm Dr. Bob Cargill. And for everyone here at Bible and Archaeology, we're wishing you everything the best.